Hi everyone, I'm Miranda. I'm a second year in Faye's group, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about practical constraints for stratospheric aerosol injections, and particularly how they could potentially contribute to risk factors, predominantly environmental risk. And hopefully this will be sort of a nice broader intro into some of the harder science talks today and sort of get the conversation started. So thanks to the past 20 years of really lovely work, we have some idea of what an ideal SAI deployment scenario looks like. And that involves minimizing the two key risks that we kind of understand, which is ozone depletion. And we can minimize this risk through the use of chemically favorable species. So that is species that limit uptake of chlorine-containing reservoir gases and lead to the production of photolabile chlorine. In addition, we can also use species that don't uptake reactive nitrogen species and partition those on the surface to limit the reaction of, or the conversion of photolabile chlorine back into reservoir chlorine-containing species like chlorine nitrate. And we can also indirectly minimize this risk through the use of strong scatterers in the shortwave. So in this case, you can lower the total amount of aerosol you need to achieve a shortwave forcing target and minimize the amount of new surface area for this chemistry that you're introducing. In addition, with stratospheric heating, you can directly lower this risk through the use of non-absorbing species in the short and the long wave. Or again, indirectly, you can lower this risk through the use of strong shortwave scatterers that scatter better, so you don't need as much mass. So these two risks kind of come down to material choice and the ability to achieve an optical particle size distribution with optimal radiative transfer properties. In addition, how you deploy really matters, which is something we understand thanks to everyone who's been doing GCM modeling. So the evenness of the stratospheric aerosol optical depth is very important and is controlled a lot by a lot of different deployment parameters, predominantly latitude. In addition to this, the lifetime of the aerosol is also another way, maximizing this is another way of mitigating risk. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the practical limitations to achieving this sort of idealized SAI scenario. So the first sort of section of my talk will be about human level factors. So sort of getting down to the question of how realistic are these best case scenarios and what sort of human factors, including things like economics and governance, could potentially limit our execution or anyone's execution in that case of such an SAI strategy. And then I'll also be talking about technical factors, particularly as it pertains to achieving optimal PSDs for solid aerosols, and how those kinds of technical constraints could potentially limit the ability to achieve this sort of best case low risk scenario, as well as how great these limitations are and what the implications are for environmental risk. So sort of going back to this idea of governance and the idea of optimal deployment parameters, thanks to many years of GCM work, GeoMIP Glens, we have a good idea of how deployment parameters interplay with things like zonal and meridional distribution of aerosols. So in particular, latitude is very important for the way the aerosol is distributed and the forcing that is induced and the patterns of warming in the stratosphere, cooling in the troposphere that result. And basically, the key here is that injecting at multiple low to mid latitudes results in the most even sAOD, whereas if you inject only at the equator, even though you have long residence times, you get tropical overcooling, which has a bunch of undesired effects. If you inject at the poles, even though there are benefits with sea ice, albedo feedbacks, and permafrost preservation, you also have these issues with patterns of uneven warming and cooling. So yeah, control over latitude is quite important when it comes to minimizing these sort of dynamic effects. And so we also sort of wanted to ask the question of, in the case that injections aren't coordinated in any way, if sort of a decentralized disperse approach was taken, what would that look like? And in this case, we sort of thought, well, populations are extremely concentrated in the Northern Hemisphere. If a bunch of local non-state actors engage in SAI efforts and concentrations end up being concentrated in the Northern Hemisphere, what are the impacts of that? And luckily, that's something that's been explored quite readily in models. And we can see this is where major issues come into play with gradients and sea surface temperatures across the equator, which has a lot of climate impacts. Basically, the point here is that controlling these sorts of deployment parameters, not just latitude, but also altitude, time of year, magnitudes of injections, longitudes of injections, is a key way of minimizing risk. In the absence of governance or sporadic or intermittent governance ultimately threatens this means of mitigating risk. Okay, now I'm going to kind of take it back to Econ 101, and we're going to talk about supply and demand. So one of the key drivers of sulfate-based SAI is that it's quite cheap, tens of billions of dollars a year to stop warming. But one of the issues potentially with some of these mineral candidates that have been proposed is that maybe they're not as earth abundant as sulfur is, and so the economics maybe aren't quite as good. So we wanted to sort of look at what supply chains would SAI-sized demands pose a threat to, and how potentially would those supply chains respond. So we use a price elasticity of demand model, which accounts for other factors' impact on the relationship between price and demand. But PED is basically the percent change of a quantity demanded in response to a percent change in price. And this is done using historic mineral data for a bunch of raw materials of these solid mineral candidates, as well as sulfur for SO2 injections. Basically, what we find is that demand for minerals is predominantly inelastic, so it's not super responsive to changes in price. And this becomes important, especially when potential demand increases due to demands related to SAI, if or when this were to take place. We also wanted to ask what kind of demands would be put on these supply chains. So we used a pretty moderate SAA strategy that I think halves the rate of increase in warming. And this second column here is that final year burden as a percent of the global production. So you can see that things like zirconia, titania, and diamond potentially have pretty small supplies in response to that increase in demand. So these are the kinds of supply chains that potentially could be threatened by a large increase in demand, particularly when considering that demand for these materials is predominantly inelastic. So to kind of like dive a little bit more into that, these are demand and inflated demand curves and supply curves for a very inelastic material. So this is lime calcite, and then ilmenite, which is a precursor for titania. And you can see that the change in equilibrium price, which is where the demand and the supply curves intersect, is much greater for a very inelastic material than it is for a less inelastic material or a more elastic material. Even though none of these are technically elastic, even marginal elasticity is beneficial when demand increases are significant because of the shape of these curves and the way that a change or an increase in price results in a more significant drop in demand for more elastic materials. So this is one potential way of gauging risk when it comes to the feasibility or the practicality of some of these scientifically lower risk injection strategies. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about technical constraints now. So one of the reasons that we talk and we think about mineral aerosols is because they're quite good scatterers. So this is this indirect means of mitigating risks. And so we can model this and see that mineral aerosols do backscatter more shortwave, so more sunlight than sulfate, particularly at these very low optimal radii. However, as you get into larger radii or larger particle number size distributions, this scattering efficiency advantage is lost. So diamond at like 0.15 microns in radius is like 3 times better than sulfate. If you go to 0.5 microns or a micron-sized particle, it's a worse scatter than sulfate. So what does this mean necessarily for the other kinds of risks that change as you increase the amount you're injecting, the surface area that you're injecting, if you're not able to achieve these submicron particle size distributions? And the reason we think about this is because I think anyone who has worked with solid particles knows that submicron solids are quite difficult to disperse. So because of their small diameter and their high density, they're what's known as Geldard's group C of hard to fluidize materials. So they tend to bunch up, they tend to form agglomerates that resist flowing in a gas. And this makes forming these kind of idealized submicron spheres quite difficult. Technically, there's a lot of ways you can try to go about achieving this. This is one example of a means of doing so, in which you start with a bulk nanopowder, you undergo some type of particle milling process where you break up larger agglomerates, before beginning to fluidize that material, and then using something like a spray nozzle to impart shear forces on the agglomerate that would result in agglomerate breakup ideally. So this is sort of like one idea of how these types of submicron particle size distributions could be achieved. And this is sort of backed by our experience with solid aerosols in lab. I won't be talking about our work with AFT SIMS experiments today. If you're interested, we have a new solid aerosol generator. You can talk to Ryan, the postdoc in our group, about this. But basically, it uses a subwoofer which operates at a given frequency and produces acoustic vibrations as well as mechanical agitation to entrain a nanopowder in a nitrogen flow. We also use carbon steel balls to further encourage agglomerate breakup. So this is like one means of generating a nice, very stable solid aerosol, which is another thing that you would potentially need when dispersing is some degree of stability. You can see, even though on like a macro level, when you look inside the generator, that these type of like agglomerates are formed. Like these are quite large. And what we see actually when we look at particle size data from our APS and SMPS, the bulk of the surface area that we're producing with this method comes from larger particles or APS-sized particles, even though the monomers of the nanomaterial we're starting with should be around 100 nanometers. So we're clearly forming aggregates without any sort of high stream jet to break them up. And the mode diameters we're getting are around 1 to 2 microns, which mass equivalent is something like 1,000 monomers, but given that it's a fractal, it's probably somewhat less. So yeah, this is clearly something that will become important if anyone ever starts to think about dispersing solids at scale. So with that in mind, I want to kind of zoom in on this last step of the proposed dispersal scheme and talk about one means of modeling agglomerate breakup likelihood in a choked convergent barrel nozzle. So I think everyone here knows how a nozzle works, but a nozzle constructs to accelerate the flow of a gas. In this case, the nozzles that we've designed are choked, so the exit velocity, or the velocity at the throat of the nozzle, is the speed of sound, and the acceleration of the gas to this choking velocity results in an inertial lag in the particle that imparts a drag force on the particle. Basically, the theory is that this drag force opposes any cohesive intermolecular forces that are holding the agglomerate together. In this case, we estimate them using a van der Waals model. In all likelihood, there's probably a lot more going on there with triboelectric charging, hydrogen bonding, etc. This is sort of like a bare minimum approach in order to gauge sort of the bare minimum amount of force you would need to break up these agglomerates. So we do this using a two-phase fluid model, and we then use a dimensionless number called a Weber number to compare the drag force exerted on the particle with the cohesive intermolecular forces holding it together. And if this Weber number is less than 1 at any point in the nozzle, we can say that agglomerate breakup is not possible at that point. We can't necessarily make any statements about whether agglomerate breakup will happen, but below this point, it's definitely not possible. So yeah, the idea is these nozzles would potentially be fixed to the outside of some sort of aircraft for injection in order to achieve dispersal at scale. And what we find is that some sort of compression system will be needed if you want to impart sufficient force on these agglomerates. So one idea sort of was that what if you just fix the nozzle to the outside of the plane and use the motion of the plane to direct gas flow through? The gas is already very fast. Maybe it has enough energy to impart sufficient force. So that curve is in red here, but because the stratosphere is such low pressure and it's very cold, so speeds of sound are much lower at lower temperatures. In addition to this, the gas is already moving quite quickly, so there's not a lot of room for acceleration in the throat of that nozzle. So peak Weber numbers in this throat region, which is the throat is reached at 0.5 dimensionless distance. You can see that the drag on the particle is not sufficient or anywhere close to sufficient to achieve agglomerate breakup. However, as you pressurize the gas, as you slow it down, as you heat it up, you get more acceleration in the throat of this nozzle. You have higher speeds of sound, higher choking velocities, and you impart more drag. This is quite sensible. All of these simulations on the left are done at very low mass fractions of solid. So in this case, this is sort of the scenario where the flow of the solid doesn't impact the flow of the gas. Obviously, if you are trying to inject significant amounts of solid, that's not a great way to think about things. So then we wanted to ask the question of what happens when maybe someone is trying to disperse this at scale, and you need much higher mass fractions of solid. So this is shown with this compressed inlet gas conditions on the right, with increasing mass fractions of solid as you go down. This is basically exactly what you would expect. Having a lot of solid in the flow limits the acceleration of the gas. You can't impart as much drag on the particle. It's much more difficult to break up. And the monomers I show here are 100 monomers. They're alumina. They're not very porous. As you get larger monomers, the Weber number distributions go up. It's easier to impart drag on a larger particle. And this increase is greater than the increase in the van der Waals forces for more of them with larger agglomerates. Smaller agglomerates are more difficult to break up because they're much smaller and it's harder to impart drag. So then we wanted to ask the question, okay, if it's hard to do this, and if whoever is potentially doing SAI does a poor job of breaking up these agglomerates, what would happen in the stratosphere? So we use a combination of me theory and mean field T matrix theory, as well as dysort in the shortwave, to model shortwave radiative transfer. This is done for mid-latitude fall, representative atmosphere, for a bunch of different solid candidates in comparison to sulfate, which is in blue, and this is shown in the optimal roughly 0.3 micron radius monomer form, which we know is like somewhat achievable with SO2 injections. Basically, what you see is that as fractals get bigger, you lose a lot of shortwave scattering efficiency, and you eventually lower it below that of sulfate, meaning that those risks potentially could significantly increase. As you would expect, increasing the number of monomers decreases shortwave forcing efficiency, meaning that they're just poorer scatterers, you have more forward scattering with larger size parameters, et cetera. In addition, decreasing fractal dimension, so having less compact fractals also results in more significant decreases in shortwave forcing efficiency. So this is basically to summarize the previous slide. As you increase monomers and decrease fractal dimension, you significantly increase risk. And compared to sort of the ideal modeled scenario, which for the GCMs that can handle solid aerosol SAI, this is typically done with submicron dispersal in this optimal monomer form on a grid box level. So compared to that scenario, the injection of fractal aggregates increases a lot of risk. It increases the requisite burden you need to achieve a shortwave forcing target. It increases the amount of surface area that you need that accompanies this increase in burden, because fractals, especially compared to mass equivalent spheres, are quite, there's a lot of surface area for chemistry to happen on, which is quite concerning. You decrease residence times, these settling velocities will be much faster, which means you need higher injection rates, you're increasing strain on supply chain. And when it comes to heating in the stratosphere, this will increase shortwave heating rates if the material that is being used results in heating in the shortwave or absorption of sunlight. And as for longwave heating, this is something we're working on at the moment, looking at longwave properties of these types of fractals and their impacts in longwave radiative transfer. So clearly there's a lot of risk associated with this type of aggregate formation or the inability to disperse monomers. So sort of some concluding thoughts. There are a lot of things we know about the lowest risk SAI strategy. We know that it requires the use of chemically and radiatively favorable materials, which is potentially limited by earth abundance and the inelasticity of mineral supply chains. We know that dispersing in optimal PSDs is quite critical, but it may be technically challenging to achieve at scale, potentially adding additional costs that may limit the executability of such a strategy. And in addition to this, there are a lot of other uncertainties that come along with aggregate formation. Even if you disperse monomers, what happens post-dispersal in the plume, which I think a lot of people are thinking about, or even in the quiescent stratosphere. This adds a lot of further uncertainties. And three, it needs to be deployed with optimal deployment parameters, which requires some sort of coordinated governance. and any sort of absent or sporadic governance potentially threatens this. And that's actually all I have for today. So thank you all.